Good morning, everyone. I'd like to dedicate this morning's learning in memory of my mother, Mrs. Shalamas Rabinowitz, Shalamas Basa Rav Yaakov Eliezer. We are in Mishna Chala, Perek Aleph, Chapter 1, Mishna Tes, Mishna 9. Hachala v'Truma. Chala and Truma. Chala is what we're discussing. When a person makes a dough, they separate a part of it for the Kohen. And as we've learned many times before, Truma is a separation from the produce that goes to the Kohen. So the point of the Mishnah is going to be here that Chala and Truma share many of the same laws. Chayavin alei misa v'chaymish. One is liable for both of them, death, meaning if one intentionally eats Truma or a Chala, and generally we find that Chala, based on a verse in the Torah, Chala is considered like Truma. So if a person a non-Kohen intentionally consumes Truma or Chala, there would be a punishment of death. That doesn't mean a capital punishment, but it means what's called Misa V'dei Shemayim, death by the hands of heaven. V'chaymish, and a fifth. The fifth is talking about that if a non-Kohen accidentally eats Truma or a Chala, they have to pay back the principal to a Kohen, and add a fifth, which really means they have to add a quarter of the price of the principal, which then turns into a fifth of the total payment. But that is what a person has to add on to their payment when they unintentionally eat Truma and Chala. Ba'asurim lazarim, they are forbidden to non-Kohanim, which would seem obvious since we just said that there's a punishment of death and a fine of a fifth for a non-Kohen who eats Truma or Chala. So it's really doesn't seem to be necessary to have to say this. And one way of explaining why it is mentioning it is because there is an opinion, and we follow that opinion, Chatzi Shir Asra Torah, which means less than the amount the Torah forbids. For a person to be liable to have to pay a chomesh, for a person to have the punishment of Misa B'dei Shemayim for eating Chala or Truma, there's a minimum amount you have to eat. You have to eat a kazayis, the volume of an olive. Less than that doesn't carry any kind of punishment, but it's still forbidden from the Torah. And that's what it means, asur lazarim. Even if less than the amount that would carry the punishments or the fine mentioned before, it is still forbidden to a non-Kohen, according to Torah law, to partake of any amount of Chala or Truma. Now again, when we talk about Chala here, it's not the word Chala referred to on Shabbos, which means the whole regular loaf of bread that we eat, but it's referring to the separation from the dough that goes to the Kohen. Both the Truma and the Chala are considered the property of the Kohen. That means if he sells these to another Kohen, he can use the money for anything that he wants. It's his regular property. Even though, again, it's a sanctified object, it has very specific laws, has a certain sanctity to it. Nonetheless, from the point of the Kohen, it is considered his regular objects, and if he sells it, the money that he gets for it, he can use for anything that he wants. And they are raised in 1 to 100. Now, this is referring to the halacha of meduma that we mentioned many times before. If Truma gets mixed into, let's say Truma grain gets mixed into other grain, and we don't know which is the Truma grain, so the halacha is that even though typically, if we're not dealing with Truma, there are times where just a majority, when you have a mixture of something forbidden and permissible, and they're the same type. So many times it's going to be enough. Just if I have the majority of the permissible over the forbidden becomes nullified, and the whole thing becomes permissible. Sometimes I need 60 times more. When it comes to Truma and to Chala, if the Truma grain gets mixed into non-Truma grain, or the Truma Chala dough, when you separate it, gets mixed into other dough, and can't differentiate where it is, you need the sages instituted, you need 100 times more for it to be nullified. And even if you have the 100 times more, you have to make a separation from this mixture, the equivalent of the amount of Truma or Chala that fell in, and give it to a Kohen. So even though it is batel, it's nullified, nonetheless, the Chachamim also says, so the Chachamim first of all said you need 100 times more. That means you have 100 times chulin non-Truma to the one measure of chulin. of truma, and whatever the measure of the original truma was that got mixed in, you have to separate it from this amount, and then even a non-Kohen can eat from any of this mixture. Not accept the mixture anymore, because it became batal 100 to 1. And this again applies both by truma and by challah. Utu'unin rechitzas yadayim, and they both need washing of the hands. That means when you separate truma, when you separate challah, you have to make sure that your hands have been washed. The sages instituted that, hands that, you're not aware that they touched anything, but you didn't necessarily, the hands didn't necessarily touch anything that would cause you to become tamei. It's as far as you're not aware that they touched anything, but it's not like you were focusing on them to make sure they didn't touch anything. That's called stam yudayim, regular hands. And the sages instituted that that's considered tummy. The hands are impure. That's a rabbinic law. The hands are impure. If these hands were to touch truma, so it would make the truma tummy, it would make the truma impure. Truma that's impure is not eaten by a kohen. Therefore, the Chachamim said, before anybody touches truma or anybody touches challah, they have to make sure to wash their hands. They have to make sure to purify their hands. You wash your hands for truma and for challah like we do for bread. And once you do that, the hands are considered pure, and you can touch the challah, the truma. But you need to wash your hands before you touch both the truma and the challah. That's what it means. They need the washing of hands. They need the setting of the sun. That means if a kohen becomes impure and he goes to the mikveh, so he has to wait for the end of the day. He has to wait for nighttime in order to partake from the truma. If he's impure, he can't partake from the truma. Going to the mikveh is what he does to purify himself. Nonetheless, he's not considered completely purified for the purposes of eating truma or challah until not only do you go to the mikveh, but it becomes nighttime. That's what it means by Rav Shemesh. You need the setting of the sun. You need nighttime. One may not take from pure for impure. Now, as we have mentioned before, let's just talk about truma right now. If you have two piles of grain, both of them are tevel, the truma hasn't been separated from them, you could actually take from one pile for the other pile. I mean, you could take from one pile for itself, amount that counts for itself, and for another pile. And from the other pile, you don't have to separate any truma. And it's not tevel anymore. It's edible. Again, assuming that you took care of the other things that have to be separated. But the point is, in order for me to separate truma and to permit grain that needs truma separated from it, I don't need to take from that pile itself. I can take from one pile for another. Now, let's say one pile of grain became impure, and the other pile is pure. And I want to go ahead and take from the pure pile the truma for the impure pile. According to Torah law, there would be nothing wrong. You would preferably want to do that because if you separate truma from impure grain, the kohen won't be able to eat it. He may be able to burn it as fuel, but he can't eat it. And therefore, the ideal way, the optimum way of separating truma for grain that's impure is not take the truma from the impure grain, but rather take it from pure grain. And that would be the truma that counts for the impure grain. And the impure grain is permissible to anybody who wants to eat it. The Mishna says the Chachamim instituted that you cannot take from pure grain for impure grain. If you have pure grain or you want to separate the truma from the pure grain for the impure grain, you're not allowed to do that. Why? It's really based on the next part of the Mishnah that says that whenever you separate truma, it has to be min amukaf. That means if I'm separating truma for anything, that other grain that's going to become permissible through my separating truma has to be close by when I'm separating it. Now, if you're dealing with a case of separating, and that's same if it's two separate piles, they have to be near each other. What exactly is the parameters of near? That we're not going to get into right now. But whatever the parameters are, it has to be nearby. Now, so if I'm going to go ahead and separate from my pure grain from my impure grain, I clearly want to make sure that the impure grain doesn't touch the pure grain, because then the truma and touch the truma after it's separated, because then the truma won't be able to be eaten by the kohanim. So the Chachamim were afraid that because you don't want to let the impure grain touch the pure grain, that you're actually going to make your separation so far apart from each other that it won't be minamukef anymore. They won't be close enough anymore. You don't want the impure grain to touch the truma, and therefore you're going to make a big distance between them so that they don't come to touch each other. And perhaps a distance you make may be too much of a distance that would then say you can't take truma off that way. And therefore the Chachamim said you may not separate truma from pure grain for impure grain. If you have impure grain, you separate the truma from the impure grain itself or from other impure grain. You give it to the kohen, deals with it as he would deal with impure truma, and that's how you fix your impure grain. But the Chachamim instituted you don't separate from pure grain for impure grain, and the same thing goes for challah. You may not separate for from a pure dough for a dough that is impure, because again, it's the same issue. When we separate challah from a dough, the dough that you're separating challah for the dough that you're separating the challah from one dough for the dough for another dough has to be nearby. The same concern, and if the impure dough were to touch the challah, it would become impure. The kohen wouldn't be able to eat it, and therefore the same concern exists when it comes to challah. If we allow you to separate from pure dough for impure dough, it may come out that they will be too far apart from each other, because you don't want the impure dough to touch the challah, that they may be too far apart from each other, and it wouldn't be minamukef, it wouldn't be near each other anymore, and therefore Allah applies to dough also. You cannot separate from pure dough for impure dough. You got to separate from impure dough for impure dough. That's that halacha. And then it says ela minamukef, and also, which is what we're discussing, separating truma, separating challah has to be done from something that is nearby. When you're separating truma or challah for other grain or other dough, those other grains or dough have to be nearby. Minadavar hagomer. And also the separating of truma and challah has to come from something completed. One is not allowed to separate truma before the grain is completely processed. That's the halach. You're not supposed to. If you do it, it can still work, but you're not allowed to separate truma from the grain before it's processed. And as we've been discussing many times before, the processing of grain depends on different grains. If we talk about a grain like wheat, then it's when or other grains are similar to that, their processing is completed when they're piled and smoothed over. That's the point that you can separate truma. But the point is, truma is supposed to be separated. Truma may only be separated from processed grain, meaning grain that's been completely processed. The same thing applies to challah. Challah, we also learn, is similar to truma, that it has to be processed before you separate the challah, and the completion of the processing of challah is when you knead it into a dough. When it's a dough and you're about to separate the challah, that means we have now the processing being completed for the purposes of separating challah. So that's what it means. The minadavar hagomer, it has to be from completed. The processing has to be completed. If you're talking about truma and grains, different grains have different things that make them be considered processed. When it comes to dough for challah, when the dough is kneaded, that is when you're supposed to take off the challah. There are going to be exceptions that we will learn for the Radam Eretz Hashem, where the sages actually wanted us to separate challah in certain circumstances before the dough was kneaded. But typically, the halacha is that one is not to separate challah before it's made from a dough. One person who says, my entire silo, all my grain, I want to make a truma, or all this dough, the entire dough, I want to make a challah. I'm going to give it all to the kohen. Lo yamar klum. He has said nothing. It does not work. The challah or the truma does not take effect until you leave over something. Something has to be left over. Based on the words of how the Torah describes challah and truma, they use the word rashis, it's the first of. Well, the first of means it's the first of something that remains. And therefore, both truma and challah, you can give a lot if you want, but you have to make sure there's something left over in order for the truma and the challah to take effect. And if you don't leave over anything, it doesn't work. It doesn't work whatsoever. And both the grain and the dough are considered tevel. We continue the laws of Lashon Harah from the Chavetz Chaim, Klal Ches, chapter 8, and we are up to Sif Yud Aleph, paragraph 11. V'gam ein chilek b'yisurai, and the prohibition of speaking Lashon Hara also applies. Whether you're saying the story over to people who are not the relatives of the person you're speaking about, or if in front of his relatives. Even a brother, about a brother to his father. It's also considered Lashon Hara. Just to go ahead and speak badly about one's brother, one's sibling in front of a parent, there's no allowance for that. Then the Chafetz Chaim adds interestingly, and even if, let's say, why are you telling over about a relative to another relative? Because you want the other relatives to rebuke him for it. It's also forbidden to speak, to say over this derogatory information about this person. You should go directly to him first. Why do you have to go in and spread bad things about him to his relatives when it's unnecessary? Go yourself and rebuke him for what he did wrong. Unless the point is that this person, sizes up the situation and he realizes that his rebuke won't help. So therefore he doesn't go directly himself to take care of it, goes to the relatives first, then it's going to be permissible because then your whole intention is for a constructive purpose and you didn't go yourself, you didn't go first yourself because you realize it's not going to help. And therefore it's necessary to tell the other relatives about what the relative did wrong. Have a wonderful day.